Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm going to go ahead and start doing some work on Chapter 8, Budget Preparation, which is something very near and dear to each and every one of us as we um, run our programs. There are basically four sources that you and I can use to run a program. First is local taxes. If we're at a secondary school or elementary school, local taxes as well as state funds are used to support the school. And so those local property taxes are used to fund some areas of the local schools. State funds, the state of Louisiana spends a whole lot of money on minimum foundation formula, also state funding for higher education. Of course, we hear in the news that it's always being cut to help balance the budget, but the state still produces millions and millions and millions of dollars in revenue for us to stay open, both at the secondary and post-secondary level. Then third, we have some federal funds. There are a whole lot of funding sources, Title IX, the 94-142, all of those federal laws provide funds from the federal level down to the state level for special needs, for guidance, gifted and talented, all kinds of programs. And so the one that I want to kind of focus on that is our bread and butter, so to speak, is the Carl Perkins Act. And let me just kind of give you a little history of the Carl Perkins Act. Back in the early 20th century, between 1910 and 1917, we fought the war, they said, to end all wars in World War I. The United States at that point was really still a very agriculturally based society. Yeah, we had a little bit of industry that was going on around the Great Lakes, the Northeast, but all in all, we were still very rural in nature. But when World War I began, we found ourselves at the federal level unprepared to fight that war. And so we had to ramp up very, very quickly to be able to get our industrial base ready to produce all of the war machinery that we needed in order to help win that war. And so as a result of that issue, the federal government formulated an act that provided funds at the federal level and that it would continue year after year after year and increase in its amounts periodically to provide vocational training. That legislation was called the Smith-Hughes Act of 1917. And we kept Smith-Hughes all the way until the 50s. We fought the Second World War, but we were not caught short-handed at that time. Smith-Hughes helped to promote industrial types of training like welders, machinists, assembly line workers. They had funds for any kind of vocational program that wanted to train in those kinds of areas, and it wasn't limited to just to that. There were also acts like the Morrill Act that um, established the land grant colleges that were dealing with practical arts, science, like engineering, agriculture, and things like that. So during the early part to about the mid 20th century, we saw a huge ramp up in vocational education, and Smith Hughes provided that. But then as we got into the late 50s, early 60s, there needed to be, I guess, some updating that was necessary to the Smith Hughes because of the new technologies. And let's face it, the Russians were the first to send a man into space and also the first to orbit a satellite. And so we were in a whole new world. The Cold War was going on. And so we needed to move to a more maybe manual based type of manufacturing to more technical. Computers were just starting to be used and realized and created. Of course, it was still a long time before we were going to get personal computers for us to use, but people began to, and industries began to see the use of computers. And so those acts that were subsequent to Smith Hughes in the late 50s, early 60s, changed the name to the Vocational Education Acts. And we had some variations of those acts throughout the 60s and 70s. But in 1980, in that decade, we began to again look at the Vocational Education Acts and all of the amendments to them, and really needed a new reorganization for vocational education from the state and local level on up. And so then we had Carl Perkins, and Carl Perkins was named after Senator Carl Perkins from Kentucky, who was a long time supporter of vocational education at the federal level. In fact, he helped to basically shape the legislation of the Vocational Education Acts of the 50s, 60s, and 70s. And so it was very appropriate that upon his death that the Vocational Education Act and its amendments was renamed the Carl Perkins Act. And of course, it's been Carl Perkins ever since. But that act really provides continuing funding for workforce training or vocational education programs at the secondary as well as the post-secondary level. If we didn't have Carl Perkins, we wouldn't have vocational ed. Let's put it that way. So it's just a major revenue source for us. Now, what do we do to plan our budgets? Every institution is different. Your book kind of gives just a generic type of outline that sequences to preparing a budget for an academic year. And so I'm just going to kind of go through that real quick. Usually, at some point of the year, you'll get some requests for budget information to department heads from institutional budget people. The officer of that local school board or institution will send out requests for budgets to those department heads. Then the department heads will then pass on that information to the instructors. And so the instructors will then formulate their budgets based on how much they'll need in the way of equipment and supplies, and come up with a good round number. And then that then will be forwarded back to the department heads. And then the department heads will then compile their numbers and then submit it to the budget officer or the chief financial officer of the school board or the institution, post-secondary institution. And then the budget officer will then, or CFO will then formulate that institutional budget to be presented at an open public hearing, whether it's to the school board. The school board will then hear the budget, and of course that's an open meeting, and the public is invited and certainly encouraged to attend and hear the budget. But then even post-secondary level, we have our budgets available for public view by our institutional advisory committees and also concerned citizens. And so our budgets are nothing secret. They're prepared and they're supposed to be transparent so that the taxpayers, who are basically the ones funding the bill, when it's all said and done, know how their money is going to be spent. And then you may have an election to increase revenue funds if necessary. Now that's not happening down here in South Louisiana. Normally, sometimes some secondary programs will, and parish systems may try to raise funds by the way of taxes, but that method of revenue has really been problematic at best. Let's face it, we have a citizenry, that's what I'm trying to say, that pretty well feels that it's overtaxed right now. And so it is extremely hard to get any kind of tax or local tax initiative passed. And those that can, more power to them. Post-secondary level, really what we often do is sometimes kind of go through foundations, companies or philanthropists who want to give money to specific kinds of programs or scholarships or things like that. We can help raise revenue by that, writing grants and things like that. But we're pretty much locked into I don't think there's any public institution of higher learning that has really gone to a local governmental agency and asked whether or not they could be put on a ballot to have some tax provided for them to exist or to supplement their budgets. I think it's an idea that maybe could be considered, but like I said, I don't like the odds for something like that passing. And then finally, your budget is approved by your governing board of the institution of the school district. And so whether it's the local school board or whether it's the LCTCS or else the state legislature that will pass the budget, that's pretty much, once that vote's taken and it passes, it's all done. Now, what's your role and my role in the budget planning? Well, you and I are going to have to face basically three major concerns in operating our laboratory. First of all, capital outlay. What kind of equipment that we might need? What about our facilities? Does it need some repair? alterations? Do we need more room? Do we want to add or expand? Those are really major dollar expenditures, and so usually those take place over a long period of time. But then we need probably the most important one is our budget for instruction. What type of supplies do we need? And certainly we can divide those into expendable supplies or non-expendable supplies. It just depends on what we're doing, to what category it's going to fit. Some instructional aids. Do we have any kind of like calculators or software or things like that that we need in order for us to teach? And also maybe some of the programs might use periodicals. I know like our like our nursing program from time to time we'll make use of nursing journals to kind of stay up to date with all the new techniques and issues surrounding that profession. Our welding program has a trade journal for, I think it's American Welding Society that puts it out. Pretty much a lot of it is pretty much a bunch of advertisements from vendors, but all in all, they do have some pertinent articles from time to time that are good reading for any kind of welding student as they prepare to go out to work. Then we've got some other types of expenses that are kind of generic to some specific programs, like equipment rental. For us, we rent all of our copiers, which is very cost effective for us. You may rent some equipment for your labs. Then we have container rental or demurrage. Best example I can give about this is welding. For all the oxygen and acetylene that we use to cut metal, we have vendors that provide that on a regular basis, and we rent the containers, and whenever they're empty, the vendor will come pick it up and change them out. We can also rent audiovisual material. There are some places where you can go to rent videos, films, and things like that. When I taught drafting, every Friday was film day. I got hooked up with a company or film library that provided us with a lot of 35 millimeter films, and you can tell how long ago that was. But they provided 35 millimeter films for you every week, and all you had to do was to pay the postage to send it back to the company. And so I jumped at that chance because a lot of the films were real life engineering and films about the world of work. And so I picked out the ones that I wanted my students to see, like how the Hoover Dam was built, how some bridges were built. They had some NASA films. How the Empire State Building, what it looks like on the inside and how it was built. These were just wonderful films that took an hour, 30 minutes for us to watch, but they were invaluable for me to kind of show students what things are like in the real world whenever you go to work. And let's face it, we didn't have enough money to take field trips to go out there and see this stuff firsthand. So they were able then to see it on film, and it made an impression on them. And obviously that kind of leads into transportation for field trips. It's going to cost us some money to rent a bus or rent some kind of transportation to get to wherever we want to go. Also, transportation of students to off-campus instructional facilities. Maybe we have a facility that our students are using to get some extra instruction. Well, we need to give them transportation from our facility to that other facility. Well, that's going to cost some in the wear and tear of our vehicles and also the gas to get there. So we need to certainly take that into account. And then, of course, co-op supervision expenses for those distributive education instructors, or those instructors that do have a co-op program within their course of study. You need some gas money because you've got to go out there and visit those sites with those students while they're out there. And so certainly we don't see you take that out of your pocket. And so you have to account for that kind of expense. And finally, the maintenance of the plant. Materials and supplies to kind of keep your lab in a repaired and safe state. You may need to replace some equipment. Some of that stuff might be getting old, and it costs too much to repair it. So you'd probably be better off to replace it, or some contracted services. Kind of getting back to our welding example. We really contracted with a welding supply company for them to go in, change the bottles of oxygen, acetylene, and MAP, whatever it is that we're using there. And then finally, some emergency services. Certainly maybe you could contract with some paramedic provider. So in case there are some accidents there at your school and in your lab, that provider will be out there right then and there to provide emergency services for you. So these are all some things that are going to cost money for us, and so we need to kind of include into it as we prepare our budgets. And certainly, these are our major concerns. Like we said, new equipment. That's a never-ending battle. If you're going to use some equipment in your shops, it's going to get used and abused and wear out, and you need to update it. And unfortunately, the prices of that stuff is not going down. Then, of course, your expendable or non-expendable supplies that you need to run your program. If you're going to teach skills and use stuff, whether it's of a expendable or non-expendable nature, you've got to have it in order to teach, and have to have enough that the students can use it and take advantage of it. And of course, demurrage, for us to be able to kind of rent those that stuff. Certainly another thing about like that would be our trash bins. Local trash company will provide us with some bins, and then charge us to come periodically empty it and dispose of it properly. Like transportation, like we said, being able to move students back and forth to work sites or to co-op sites. Our maintenance of the plant, trying to keep our labs in a good state of use, and keep them repaired. The department head. A department head has a responsibility to maybe oversee a number of programs. He or she is going to really be a key individual in coming up with that final budget. And then, of course, going through the budgeting and planning process. You just don't sit down one night and decide this is what it's going to cost me. This takes time to put together. It takes a lot of thought, a lot of practice. For those of you that are brand new instructors, you really don't get the handle of this until you've taught for about 2 or 3 years, where you go through the process a number of times. Once you then kind of have an idea of how much in the way of supplies you're going to need, whether it's expendable or non-expendable, you get an idea. But if you're brand new, you're really taking a lot of guesses. And of course, it's great if you have some colleagues around that you can call, kind of pick their brain to see what they think would be the most appropriate way to help you until you've got that experience. So that wraps up budgeting and planning. And I will go ahead and shut this video down right now.